fear-free association. This new technique, like fear analysis, psychoanalysis, involves actually practicing a practice and then reflecting on that practice and doing a fear analysis on the practice of the initial fear analysis. In this case, is what I'm going to do is go in and out of the first video I created for the FFA technique. And I'll just walk through and respond, and we'll see how far I go. This won't be complete or anything, but I'm very aware of wanting to talk to you about during doing that first process, that first technique. I was very aware that it is a way of actually imagining myself in a fear experience, a fear state, if you will, in a relationship with fear, active, that I could actually practice that technique while I was in that condition. Whereas I had to sort of imagine that, especially upon reflection, imagining it, because it wasn't happening. I wasn't entering, a full florid fear state while I was doing the technique. So, but I imagine that it can be very useful to use while you're in that florid state of a fear experience. So I'm going to share this video now. Let's pull it up. And we'll just begin watching, and I'll stop and comment as we go. Right, so this is what's called an induction entry for me and for someone doing this process, where I basically want to use certain veils or performative veils to get me out of ordinary time. So blowing the nose actually reminds me right now, even though it's completely spontaneous and something you're not supposed to do, it's a bit of a taboo, right, in terms of public exposure, and certainly putting it onto a piece of film or video for public presentation. Yes, I have to walk through all of my embarrassment, fear about doing that. So I almost just immediately found something that I could jump. It's like a bit like jumping off the cliff and saying, okay, now I'm going to talk about fear management. Well, I did this very simple technique of doing something that would be a taboo, and now I'm going to talk about fear-free association connected to it. And then the moving of the hat over the eyes was to, again, almost like a shamanic, I see it as a shamanic move right now as I'm analyzing this, of representing, if I was to write on top of that hat, I would say fearlessness. So again, eventually I will move the hat. So these are inductions to get us into into another state of time. And obviously, as a viewer, I get to also think about how might I do that. You as a participant of this technique could think about how you might want to do that in the future. Use of the linear timer, digital, electronic, modern, is actually a really nice contrast as I'm looking now between this sort of primal way that I was inducing myself into an altered time, space experiencing, as I say, somewhat primal, shamanic, through those devices I use for induction. Here is another kind of induction that juxtapose, and they're kind of balancing each other. And this induction is linear time. This is the time that we live in now, normal time, right? That is in some sense not exposed to particular, or not hooked to the other time. There's a certain independence, they're related, but there's an independence between the two times. So now I'm just basically saying to myself and to the audience watching this is only going to last 5 minutes. So can you attend for 5 minutes? Knowing that, my experience has always been I can go deeper into something if I know it's only for a certain amount of time, especially to be extremely vulnerable. Also, a listener or reviewer, the witness, can also, knowing that it's a limited time, be with another person in a peer support way, in a healing support way for a limited time is usually much more effective than a time that seems endless or infinite, or how long is this going to go for? So people will start getting into their own fear about watching someone in fear if they don't have some kind of linear time that's outside marking that there's going to be an ending and we agree to that ending. So it's that agreement that builds trust for going into places where it can be mistrustful, messy, very emotional or whatever, just scary thoughts, etc. Removing of the hat, I see it now as a vulnerable unclothing move gesture to say I'm as vulnerable as you. I could take off all my clothes if I wanted to be even more vulnerable, but now it's the uncovering. Mom. So mom. This is MOM, ma, mom. These are very primal syllables and phonemes for the most primal connection we have to Mother Earth, to our mothers, a place of birth. So I see this beginning, interestingly enough, as a beginning, and all the vulnerabilities of that beginning, which are both can be incredibly joyful, that connection with mom, ma, and also the hurts that follow from being birthed into the world. And that's the complementarity of opposites, so-called, the two parents that every child has to come into that first primal connection with. My relation to mom, and then my relation to dad is not mom. I find that a very interesting juxtaposition. So there's a lot of talk in psychoanalysis of that kind of notion, especially from Adam Phillips, that theorizes that the child is always experiencing everybody and everything more or less as not mom, not the original matrixial bonding. Swimming. That's a very interesting word to come after mom, dad, which is part of the conception. Mom being the birthing source, the womb, and the child being basically a swimming being in liquid material, right from its complete gestation, right from the fusion of sperm and egg. We're basically a little fish for 9 months, more or less, even though we go through evolutionary steps. So I think there's a real deep evolutionary trajectory going on in my free association here. And now let's just watch where it goes from swimming. I'm not a water person. I'm not. I'm not a water person. It's almost perhaps symbolic of I am not from my mom. And that's not to say in an absolute or linear sense or concrete literal sense or logical sense of that term, but it is also true that I'm generally not somebody who is heavily invested or delights in being in water, being submerged, especially. There's various reasons for that I won't go into, but definitely fears of perhaps drowning, fears of that's not a safe space. And I'm obviously already playing on deep terror of survival and these early primal issues around survival. I prefer the desert. Don't drink water much. So people often, especially with this obsession for drinking water because of some research that came out some 20 years ago or something, you see people walking around with water bottles, for example. I find this not only extremely strange, whether you want to believe in that data or not. I don't even know the data on the effects of positive water. I'm not saying water isn't positive to drink, but I find there's like an obsession. It's a little bit like children walking around with their milk bottle wanting their mommy. So I'm making that association here of I want to differentiate from that fear-based patterning I see. Perhaps that's what's going on here. But the search for autonomy to go into the desert, there's a sort of spiritual quest there as well from the family, from the norm, from the world that I see is culturally very much a culture of fear. Not as much as it's supposed to. So I've been guilted and shamed, I believe, from many people about you should drink more water. And I've had that from so many people over the years. And I eventually joked about it, calling myself a desert rat. So it is interesting. I'm making the not contradiction, but the contrast between desert and water here, and playing out what I think is a kind of a shaming, guilting process that has gone on, and that's always, to me, those are the cousins of fear that are trying to work into and upset my being to, or even disturb it. Now, they may say, people who say these things are trying to correct it, make me healthier because it works for them, or there's research that shows that's healthier. But to me, it's not a good health education. It's not a good transmission pedagogically or therapeutically for the way people communicate that with me. And I've been laughed at around it and so on. Peeling back. Really peeling carefully. This is like another induction for peeling. I don't know where that word associated why it would have come in, but it's a little bit, as again, I'm making the distinction between my autonomy as a self in evolution and development for myself from this culture of fear matrix in a way that I've already sort of been challenging, and you can see pushing out from, differentiating myself. Not that I completely am against it, but now I'm going to peel. So peeling, of course, is a really good metaphor for more vulnerable introspection, and I have to not just look at what the society is doing and that I don't want to do for my identity, and that can be a very fear-based identity because I can feel very much like a victim to that world, and I do at some level. It's interesting going to be now to see, I want to peel back into perhaps my own victimness and my own creation of my contribution to what is an oppressive culture. So theoretically, I'm going to be looking at some layers of my own repression within the context of oppression in the culture and in my family and in my relations. Finding, forgetting, feeling. So I'm staying with the F there, and I'm not surprised because this is a process of fear-free association. So fear and the F always have a lot of phonemic consonants for me. I like playing with those terms and just feeling the fear, forgetting, remembering, finding, kind of a searching going on here for what will be the next association. So I feel like the subconscious here is just starting to kind of now bounce around a little bit more, and things are going to pick up. Fright, fullness, lingering, singing.
pulling back.
I think you heard it moved from the sound to the ing sound to off the ing. I came to stinging. So I say I'm not sure if it's an I, ego I, or whatever, but when I talked about victimhood experiencing and through this unpeeling just a few moments ago, look what revealed right here. It's stinging. Well, quickly, stinging is being victimized, whether it's by a bee or whether it's bee, but it's come from somebody who said something that stings, hurts, words hurt, ideas hurt, expressions from people's faces can hurt, they can sting. Now, sting is a little bit more euphemistic than a deep hurt or even trauma, but I think you can hear that to do fear work like this, to do fear analysis work on oneself, stinging is an interesting, good word to start with. One could probably do quite an analysis around that. Certainly, I've had lots of dreams where bees are stinging me, or a snake or something's trying to bite me, or a dog or a bear or whatever it might be. And so it's deep in the unconscious of being bitten, being stung. And stung is interesting because it often is related to numb, a numbness that comes from being stung too many times and not being able to recover. Can be very deeply damaging to the self and the ability to recover and re-regulate, etc.
Forcing. Ugh, squirrel with nuts. Can't beat them too hard.
So that was just an image. Squirrel with nuts, can't eat them too hard. It was it's a sign that I walk by every day when I come back from the studio, walking on my way home. I'm kind of in between worlds, this artistic aesthetic world, maybe 5-6 hours in the studio where I'm kind of quite lost to the rest of the normal world as I'm working. And then I come out, and within about 100 steps or so, I confront this huge commercial billboard, and it's got a huge squirrel on it. I don't even know who it's a commercial for. It's probably a phone company or something. And this big squirrel with this pile of nuts of abundance around it, and it's holding this nut in its mouth. And I don't know why I've paid attention to that, but what psychoanalysis and free-floating attention here, this process of free association, is letting those things just come in and pop in if they do. And why have I been attending to that sign? There's a possible motivation there. And I'll just leave it without going into depth here on that imagery. We could just to say the kind of conclusion, which I haven't had when I watch the sign, because I just attend to it and then keep walking on the way to the C train. But here, there was a new addition that came in as too hard, too hard to break, too hard to digest, too hard to. So the food, right, the abundant source available, like nuts are like money for a squirrel. They are all the goodness of nature. I'm in my cultural world walking and seeing this representing. I'm speaking right now of there's something too hard. There's a nut, which could be very similar to a knot. And I'm talking K-N-O-T, that is a bunch of woundedness, a bunch of fear complexes with that woundedness that are perhaps impenetrable or seemingly so.
Hard to do this work.
So then I added the more expression for the hard. It's just hard to do this work. So that's another interpretation of the nuts. Many interpretations of these symbols, these metaphors, these phonemes that are being expressed in free association.
Finding my way.
I return to the repetition. So in the unconscious, doing fear analysis or psychoanalysis, repetition is always really important. It's almost like a bit of a ritualized linguistic processing to go back and repeat something that seems worth attending to. which maybe I wasn't attending to before, maybe I was, maybe I'm obsessing on it, but maybe it's just something that was missing and now is getting a lot of attention in this altered state, if you will, of free association. So being lost and being found, losing and finding, I would say these are really fundamental processes, always going to be related to some kind of fear patterning process.
Losing my way. Faring okay. Fair-colored child.
So losing then comes up, losing my way. That is an association with studying Adam Phillips's psychoanalysis work on the importance of the kind of methodology, the epistemology, the way of knowing of psychoanalysis as practice and theory is definitely one of what he would say something like is as important, it is as important to lose ourselves in the search for something, knowledge, truth, wisdom, whatever it might be, so that we can truly in that losing let go of that which we're attached to, where we're perhaps arrogant, hubris, over determined that we know the truth already, don't need to really search more. So any true inquiry like this process, and I would like to say the way I do fear analysis, the way I do fearology, is and ought to involve a losing and then finding, losing again, finding process, so that we keep the inquiry open and don't assume that we always know what fear is from the start. So it's a bit of a deconstruction technique here, a postmodern deconstruction going on. So that's 3 minutes, 2 seconds into that tape, and you can see just quite a well spring of really interesting ideas. I mean, it's the first time I've done it on that tape. I've watched that tape a few times, but it's just like, wow, okay, in 3 minutes, I got so much there that I could keep working with and will in some way. And to remember that even if I don't consciously work on analyzing that, and then even going back and watching this video I'm creating now and fear analyzing that to build, to find my way, to lose my way, this constant creating of a defense intelligence about and around the nature of my relationship and our relationship as humans to fear. You can see I'm not trying to define fear, but I'm staying in touch with this process. So it's got these meta reflections upon another reflection upon another reflection. Some people might say, well, that's really stupid. Where's that going? You can do that forever, and that's like navel gazing. And so, but the world needs to, manage fear, and we've got real big problems to solve concretely. Come on, man, get down to it. Put the rubber on the pavement. Enough of this spinning. Well, you can see I'm not spending my whole life doing this video, and you can see I only did this technique for 5 minutes, and I'm basically only putting in a few hours, more or less. So it's not all my world, and it's not the only way I'm trying to work in the world of bringing about change and liberation, transformation, healing. But you can see I do have an emphasis on doing a good analysis before I try to solve both issues within myself, within my relationship to fear and to the larger world, and what ought to be going on to bring about more healthy, sane, and sustainable society. Thanks for watching this today.